Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be the initial speaker for this, I think, very important forum. And I appreciate the privilege of getting a chance to talk to you people about something that matters a lot to me. And it's funny that I find myself kind of nervous and anxious about this. I am a blatherer by trade. I talk all the time. And yet when I find myself talking about animal welfare issues and animal research, it just sort of goes up a notch, and I find myself much more emotional about it than when I'm teaching just generic neuropathology or neuroanatomy. So you have to forgive me if I sound more anxious than usual. Trust me, I could bore the pants off you if you were talking about anything other than animals in research. I wanted to start by tooting my own horn. There are a few more obnoxious sounds than someone tooting their own horn. And so I blame this on my wife because she was helping me prepare this, and she said, first of all, you have to show them your credentials. And I said, but that's very self-aggrandizing, and it's kind of embarrassing. And she goes, trust me, no one will pay any attention to you unless you establish your credentials. I'm married to you, and I don't pay any attention to you. So you have to tell them why you have an opinion about this as a result of your life experience in research and in medicine. And I was having a discussion with some members of the panel earlier about words and how important words are. And I'm kind of a word nut, as a matter of fact. And it's probably because I was a literature major, and so words are a big deal to me. And I always teach by going back to the etymology of words. And I always say if you have to have a conflict about what a word means, we'll go to the dictionary. And Noah Webster is trump in what a word actually means. The interesting thing about words, of course, is that words don't just describe reality. Words create reality. And people know that, and they try to frame arguments, and they try to influence conclusions by the way words are used. So we have to be very careful about words. But I'm going to be using some words today that will be, some people will say, are inflammatory or emotional. And so every time that happens, we're going to go back and touch base with what the dictionary definition is and see if that is a valid application of the word. The thing about credentials, I like credentials. They get you a job, and then they get you promotions and all. But every once in a while, they take you to strange places, like Madison, Wisconsin, in the dead of winter. And the reason I got involved in animal issues is some medical students initially came up to me when I was teaching medical students, and I also practice medicine. And these students at UCSD, and all of the stuff I'm talking about that I can vouch for is from UCSD. I have reason to believe that much of it is similar to what goes on at the University of Wisconsin. But I want to stipulate that I can be an expert on the University of California use of animals and a couple other contexts. And I will defer to local authorities as to whether that applies to what's going on at the University of Wisconsin. Anyhow, at UCSD, some medical students came up to me and they said, you make no secret of your affection for dogs. Do you know that they're still killing dogs in freshman physiology and pharmacology? And I said, no, I didn't know that. And then they asked me, well, you practice medicine. They tell us that you need to kill these dogs in order to be a doctor. And we want to know if that's true. And I said, no, it's clearly not true. And one of my guilty secrets in the past is when I was a medical student, I killed dogs. I killed a dog in physiology, and I killed another dog in surgery because they told me to do it. And I was just too gutless to stand up to authority figures at the time. And now that I've been practicing medicine for a long time, I realized how unnecessary that was. I often get stumped by a diagnosis. I do clinical pathology. I look at brain tumors from all over the community and even all over the world, actually. So I'm something of an expert in brain tumors, and sometimes I get a brain tumor and I don't know what it is. And I have to show it to colleagues and do special stains, and I have to weasel and equivocate. I've never been in a clinical situation where I thought if I'd only killed more dogs, I'd be able to help this patient. So I told the students, no, you don't need to kill dogs to be a doctor, but don't take my word for it. So we organized a Doctors Against Dog Labs, and we got 300 San Diego physicians to sign a petition urging the physiology and pharmacology faculty not to kill dogs. We said, we're doctors, we know you don't need to do this, don't kill the dogs. But they were PhDs, and they thought they knew what it took to be an MD, and we said, you know, you're not even doctors, not real doctors, no offense, but you don't practice medicine, and it got to be a big brouhaha. So that's how I got started in animals. And then some notoriety came from that, and I was contacted by an animal welfare group that asked me to look at a grant that contended it was going to help find the cause and cure of Alzheimer's disease. And it was a primate vivisection grant. And it had to do with looking at visual pursuit, smooth visual pursuit, and the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And I'm going to talk about that at some length because I got a copy of the grant and I read it. And I realized they had to work hard to find a system less related to Alzheimer's disease than the visual vestibulo-ocular reflex and smooth visual pursuit. It has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease. So I went up to San Francisco and tried to persuade their board of supervisors to prohibit this particular experiment that was going on at UCSF. It's a funny paradox. The two places that I always think of as the most liberal, the most knee-jerk liberal places are the People's Republic of Berkeley around San Francisco and the People's Republic of Madison. And those are the two places where they do the most primate vivisection. That seems very odd to me. Anyhow, so that's how I got involved in all of this stuff. And that's, the tenure is kind of nice. That allows me to come here and make these kind of presentations and they can't fire me. So that's how I got started with this. And so today I want to talk about the ethics and efficacy of experimentation on animals, common ground or no man's land. Three things. Ethics is it right or wrong? Is it a good thing to do or is it a bad thing to do? And efficacy is, does it work? Does it produce the result that it promises to produce? If a primate vivisection experiment is sold as this is going to help find the cause and cure of Alzheimer's disease, is there any evidence that that's true? And wouldn't that change our final conclusion? Do the ends justify the means? Basically, the ethics of doing research on animals, as far as I can tell, always come down to the ends justify the means. So we have to know, what are the ends? Are the ends to learn more about visual tracking? Are the ends to learn more about the vestibulo-ocular reflex? Are the ends to increase our basic neuroscience knowledge of neurophysiology? And if those are the ends, then the question is it worth making the monkeys go through some pretty horrible experiences to do that? Or do you want to raise the ante and say, well, no, the ends are to cure human diseases. And if this will cure a human disease, maybe we'd be willing to do something to a monkey that we wouldn't be willing to do if it was just to find out more about the neurophysiology of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. So that's efficacy. Does it work or not? And experimentation on animals, again, I want to define terms very carefully. We're only concerned with experiments that hurt animals. Nobody cares. In fact, we kind of like it if Jane Goodall wants to crouch behind a bush and take notes on what the chimps in Gombe are doing. And I know a guy who does experiments on dog intelligence, and people bring their dogs, and they love it. It's like when you do infant development experiments, and people bring their babies, and they find out how smart their babies are. So nobody cares. That's great. Love those experiments. We're only concerned with experiments that harm animals physically, which is vivisection. I'll define that in a minute. Or psychologically. I say Harry Harlow is a big hero around here, I notice. Yeah. But he really did pretty horrible things. He did what I think of as psychological vivisection. He managed to prove that you can make a monkey fearful, neurotic, miserable, almost suicidal. And he proved that happens when babies don't have their mothers. And in California, the kids would kind of go, well, duh. But anyhow, I think of some psychological treatment of animals amounts to psychological vivisection, but that's kind of a stretch for the definition. So let's define our terms. Ethics of experimentation on animals. We're first going to look at the ethics. Is it right to do this or is it wrong to do this? And then we'll look at the efficacy. Do the experiments produce the promised result? So first of all, history gives us no reason to think that the ethics of scientists are any better than the ethics of non-scientists. Quite the opposite, in fact. You can do some very efficacious science that's totally unethical. And you probably are all familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and the Guatemalan syphilis experiments and the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. And in my field, there's a disease called Hallervorden-Spatz disease, which was named after Dr. Hallervorden, who was a Nazi. No hyperbole, no exaggeration, really a Nazi doctor. And he was interested in some mentally impaired children. And as long as they were exterminating them anyway, he said, listen, boys, bring me those kids' brains. And he published 12 papers after the war. And it was good science. There's no doubt about it. It was good science. It's valid science. We still know that the disease that he described causes certain signs and symptoms. The confusion comes when we start talking about good science. But science isn't good or bad. Science is an amoral enterprise. Science, when we talk about good science, what we really mean is valid science, reproducible science, science that teaches us something about the way the world or the way animals or the way humans work. That's valid science. But it gets confusing when we start to say that's good science. It's not good in the moral or ethical sense. It's simply valid science. And efficacy and ethics are uncorrelated domains. There's no reason to think as efficacy goes up, ethics goes up, or that it goes down. There's no relationship at all. It might be very efficacious if somebody really annoys you to shoot them in the head. That's very efficacious, but it's not very ethical. So there's no relation, no inherent relationship between ethics and efficacy. And it's confusing to talk about good science versus bad science when people think good and bad means right or wrong. And then if I was making these slides again, I think I would have made a separate slide with just this sentence on it, and I would highlight it and underline it and put an asterisk by it, that like-minded people and groups gravitate to the more extreme positions held in common. And I think that's the foundation of all of this conflict. And that was discovered by psychologists, group psychologists, and they didn't bolt anybody into a chair or drill any holes in their skulls or anything. They did very ethical experiments, and they found it's a little bit counterintuitive. But you get like-minded people, and they don't gravitate towards a bell curve in the middle of their commonalities. They skew to the far left or to the far right. It's a little funny. So liberals who only hang out with liberals don't end up being sort of moderately left of center. They become very liberal. And the same thing with conservatives. And if you don't believe that, all you have to do is channel surf over to Keith Olbermann for a while. And he's funny. I enjoy Keith Olbermann. And he's ranting and raving, and he's frothing at the mouth about liberal causes. And then, for a change of pace, you can go listen to Glenn Beck. And you realize, oh my God, like-minded people in groups gravitate to extreme positions. And they've lost their reality testing. And I think that explains a lot of what goes on in what I call vivisection, and I'll define that term in a bit, is that the people who do it and the people who approve it have already concluded that it's okay, and then they become increasingly extreme. I'm going to show some pictures of primate vivisection, and when I was getting this talk ready, some of my best friends are vivisectors in one sense. I work in a neuroscience laboratory. I work with guys who do rat and mouse work. They don't really vivisect. They create transgenic mouse models, and then after a while they test the mice to see how smart or stupid they are, and then they kill them. But that's not quite the same thing as vivisection. They don't actually operate on them while they're alive. Anyhow, they walked in while I was getting some of these pictures ready of some of the primate research, and they recoiled in horror. They go, oh, come on, nobody does that. And I said, yeah, people do this. I mean, they said things like, those pictures must be faked. And I said, no, they're not faked. And this is from people that actually experiment on animals for a living, but they're just rat and mice men. And when I was protesting outside the neuroscience convention, there was a big neuroscience convention in San Diego, and I'm like a dork. I'm holding up a sign with a vivisected primate on it. It was surprising how many of the neuroscientists who would come by and they'd say, geez, that's terrible. I only use rats and mice. I'd never do such a thing. And the problem is, again, this like-minded people in groups gravitating to the extreme position held in common. And that's actually, I'm going to come up with a solution to all this, and I'm sure everyone will agree at the end and we'll fall into each other's arms and sing kumbaya. I think ethical determinations about doing science should not be left to the scientists, because the scientists are the least qualified people to make ethical determinations. Their ethics are no better than ours. Well, I'm a scientist, so I kind of want to play both sides of the street. But the ethics of a scientist is in no way better than the ethics of a non-scientist. And history actually indicates they might be worse. They have all the expertise in the world to talk about efficacy, about how to do something, but they're not the ones to say whether or not we should do it. Just like war is too important to be left to generals, I think ethical decisions about whether or not to do vivisection should not be left to vivisectors. In law, there's the term recusal. They're the first people who should be recusing themselves. The people who tend to profit, literally profit in that they make money, and profit in their careers and their publications and their research agendas, they'd have to be saints not to be influenced by that. But the way the system is set up now, they're the ones who make the decision as to whether or not we should proceed with primate vivisection. Major. And so words are a big deal to me, and I always teach by going back to the etymology of words. And I always say if you have to have a conflict about what a word means, we'll go to the dictionary. And Noah Webster is Trump in what a word actually means. The interesting thing about words, of course, is that words don't just describe reality, words create reality. And people know that, and they try to frame argument credentials. I'm married to you, and I don't pay attention to you. So you have to tell them why you have an opinion about this as a result of your life experience and research and in medicine. And I was having a discussion with some members of the panel earlier about words and how important words are. And I'm kind of a word nut, as a matter of fact. And it's probably because I was a literature, but anything other than animals and research. I wanted to start by tooting my own horn. There are a few more obnoxious sounds than someone tooting their own horn. And so I blame this on my wife because she was helping me prepare this, and she said, first of all, you have to show them your credentials. And I said, but that's very self-aggrandizing, and it's kind of embarrassing. And she goes, trust me, no one will pay any attention to you unless you establish your... Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be the initial speaker for this, I think, very important forum. And I appreciate the privilege of getting a chance to talk to you people about something that matters a lot to me. And it's funny that I find myself kind of nervous and anxious about this. I am a blatherer by trade. I talk all the time, and yet when I find myself talking about animal welfare issues and animal research, it just sort of goes up a notch, and I find myself much more emotional about it than when I'm teaching just generic neuropathology or neuroanatomy. So you have to forgive me if I sound more anxious than usual. Trust me, I could bore the pants off you if you were talking about